I'm Yasmin. I am a writer and academic and activist, and I'm mostly based right now in Chicago. I write a lot about queer politics and politics in general. I'm especially interested in sexuality, women's issues. But that kind of change happens organization to organization, right? So yeah, so we can say, okay, look, let's look at X organization and fix it and see what we can do to change it. But in a larger way, the question you raised is, can they become less neoliberal? The problem is that the gay community is so profoundly neoliberal that there's a lot of work to be done in just shifting the culture at that stage. I think the way ahead is difficult. I think there are organizations that are not necessarily quintessentially gay. For instance, Chicago Freedom School, and full disclosure, they're a huge supporter of Gender Just, with which I work. But Chicago Freedom School, for instance, is very queer, even though it's not a queer organization. But it does a lot of work around police brutality, around empowering youth to be able to make economic and political decisions on their own, and so on. So it's very much tied to a sort of civil rights movement style of politics, right? So I think organizations like that need to be supported much more. But the problem is that in the gay community, I think a lot of people, and this is exactly what happened with gay marriage, a lot of people are fed into the idea that the only way we can get help is if we keep throwing money towards these larger organizations. With a place like Central and Halstead and other places like it, the other problem, and I saw this a lot when I was doing reporting, the big problem is that a lot of gays and lesbians really do feel that they need something not so crusty, hippy-dippy-doo like these smaller organizations, but they need something really fancy and nice looking. Again, to go back to your larger issue around corporations, right, and the influence that they have on politics. The idea is that, well, if we want to be respectable and if we want to be taken seriously, we must have something like that lovely theater at the top of Central and Halstead, to which very few people gain access unless they've paid tickets, right, ticket prices, very large ticket prices. So there's this larger idea within the gay community of wanting legitimacy, and that legitimacy only looks a certain way. So there's that issue as well. But there's also, in terms of neoliberalism, so the biggest problem is in terms of who gets to access resources. So the Central and Halstead has, places like the Central and Halstead have the staff and the resources to write the grants. They have the political connections. Chicago is an extremely gay city. Chicago is a city where if you are a reporter looking for the gay source, like 60% of City Hall is gay, practically, sometimes, I think. So it's a question of resources. Who has resources? Who has, more importantly, who has access to resources? Who has access to Obama in this city? Who will have access to Hillary Clinton when she ascends to power? It's a question of access and resources, and that, I think, is where the struggle lies. And I don't know what the resolution to that will be, because I think getting there is a lot harder than people want to acknowledge, and it makes them less likely to want to work on that. This is a very gay neoliberal city in terms of how much power is accrued to how many very well-connected gay people, gays and lesbians. So sometime in the mid-90s, essentially what happened is that the queer community lost a significant amount of its political energy, in large part due to the massive losses it faced after AIDS. And what came into that vacuum was a group of upwardly mobile or extremely wealthy gay men, mostly men, almost all white, who wanted a different kind of gay identity. So they no longer wanted to be associated with that sort of, AIDS activist organizing world, and they wanted a different kind of gay identity, which was more corporate, yes, more suburban, more quote-unquote all-American, more quote-unquote normal, and they had the money. And that's when it's 1992, in fact, that you see the rise of the Human Rights Campaign, which is today the world's largest and wealthiest, has a budget of over 30 million, 30, world's largest gay organization. And until then, what you had was the National Task Force, which is now I think it's just called the Task Force, but the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force had been one of the more prominent gay organizations. Sort of at the time, it was a little bit more lefty oriented and more activisty, as it were. But what you saw in the 90s was a general kind of neoliberalization, especially in New York, where you are right now. In the mid-90s, early 90s is when you saw the cleanup of Times Square. So the Times Square that you know now, as you know, is completely unrecognizable. And you saw sort of the scouring out of the sex stores, and now what you have is a giant Disneyland, right? So, but neoliberalism also, neoliberalism has been around since around the late 60s and 70s, and perhaps even a little earlier than that. Neoliberalism has been a part of the gay community for a long time, but at the same time, I would also say that the gay community now is a really big cog in the machinery of neoliberalism, especially in the shape of gay marriage, because gay marriage made it natural to assume that the state could abdicate its responsibilities for taking care of people, and that it was up to now people and their individual relationships. And that's a primary signifier of neoliberalism, the idea that the state bears no responsibility for something as basic as healthcare, right, or education and all of that, but that individuals must now negotiate that on their own. So that's somewhere, and that is something that gay marriage, because of the massive fight that it became, and the way that it is now seen as such a triumph of rights discourse, that's how gay marriage helped strengthen neoliberalism. So on the one hand, you had neoliberalism is what gave rise to the gay rights movement as we know it today. And then gay marriage and gay rights became the kind of a giant spoke in the wheel of neoliberalism. So it's now enabling neoliberalism to become much stronger. So it's no surprise, for instance, that in Britain, which has had a very strong public health care system, the National Health Service, it is no surprise that the fight for gay marriage comes along with a weakening of the national health system. I think one of the Bernie Sanders reps actually mocked the Human Rights Campaign, and he did it beautifully because the HRC came out and supported Hillary Clinton. And I remember the rep from the Sanders campaign say something like, well, what does HRC do anyway these days? But it was wonderful to see that. I remember thinking, you go, you know, that's excellent. So I think, yes, there's change afoot, but let's see where it goes. It is so ridiculous to boycott any corporations for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, if you're going to go around boycotting people because of their politics, you can't go to your local bodega even, because you don't know what their politics are. And really that should not be the determinant, because people do have a right to their politics. You know, so there's that issue, but there's also the question of, right, empty PR, and again, yes, the boycott of North Carolina, whom does it really affect in the long run? I don't know, the business of boycotting, especially southern states, it also comes laden with so many stereotypes of what white southerners are like. And there's this terrible way in which I think in the United States it's okay to mock people who are white and poor in ways that we are not allowed anymore to mock, rightly so, not mock anyone for being black, right? So there are all these sort of multiple narratives that come up. And I think, again, you know, we tend to turn to corporations to lead the way, but they only lead the way if it's financially suitable for them. I remember I took a friend of mine to Lakeview, to Boys Town once, saying, come and see my people. And all my people were apparently these, you know, hipster suburbanites with their children and strollers. And then we ran into a friend of ours, you know, who is gay, and he said, oh yeah, we've been gentrified out a long time ago. There's a complicated narrative around displacement and gentrification. So before the gays, there's often always poor migrants who actually come into a neighborhood. So the way neighborhoods shift is that you have people being pushed out from the center of a city towards the margins. And it's often the poorest migrants who need cheap housing who set up a neighborhood. And then they set it up, they turned it into a neighborhood, and then you get the quote unquote creative class, right? The artists and so on, the filmmakers, right? Who move into a neighborhood. That's sort of one of the first waves of gentrification. And then you also get the gays. And the stereotype about gays moving into neighborhoods is that they pretty it up because, again, stereotypically, because gays are so good at converting houses and so on, and they have such fabulous taste, etc. That's sort of the stereotype. But it ignores the kind of sedimentation of different waves of neighborhood shifts that come about. If you think about a neighborhood like Pilsen, for instance, which is being rapidly gentrified now, Pilsen was a majority Latino community. The city does, and those are the areas that the city gives no resources to in terms of street lighting, in terms of something as basic as street lighting, which I knew from my time in Uptown. My place in Uptown was swallowed up by Andersonville, but until then, we didn't have a decent street light, right? So transportation, street lighting, grocery stores. If you think about Hyde Park, which is still a food desert, even with Whole Foods right now.
There is a Whole Foods here?
Yes, there's a Whole Foods, and it makes no difference to a lot of us because we can't afford to shop there anywhere. But there is a Whole Foods now. Yeah, there's a Whole Foods right on 51st, I think, yes. So there are all these waves of migration that we tend to forget about. So the reason, but it's the gays and the creative classes who come in sort of towards the end. And they happen to come from they have more money generally. The creative classes don't. But the rents start to go up. Gay people sort of, the stereotype is that gay people fix up the neighborhoods and then straight upper middle class people, mostly white, come in and then start jacking up the prices because they want to move into those nicer neighborhoods, quote unquote. So that's what's happening in Andersonville, is what's happening in Rogers Park right now, for instance. It's simply a question of, I think it's in a city like Chicago, it's just a question of expansion. It's a question of upper middle class people wanting places to live in. It's because Lincoln Park, Lincoln Square, those areas have become completely unaffordable now. Downtown is obviously out of reach for a lot of people. So it's just a question of wanting better, more affordable real estate that people think of as investments. And gay people, depending on their income, are often at the forefront of that. But there are also a lot of LGBTQ people who are, for instance, Latino and poor, and who also live in Pilsen, who don't get counted in all this narrative about gentrification, right? So the problem also becomes in terms of how we think about who gays are. But gay marriage is being forgotten about as an issue, and in some ways that's largely because, well, we got gay marriage, so everyone thinks that's not an issue anymore. My concern, though, is with the lingering effects of what gay marriage has done, right? So the big effect, for instance, like I said, is that marriage is now seen as the reality that people have to adopt, right? So if you want healthcare, in many cases, especially if you're living, if you're either in a corporation again, like I think Xerox, for instance, and IBM have instituted this, that you have to get married. The logic is simply that since everyone can now get married, everyone must get married if you want your health care, right? So there's that there's the long-term effect of that. But there's also the fact that gay marriage is essential, has naturalized the idea that it's intimate relationships and their relationship to the state that matter more than larger community-wide issues. So, gay marriage was always fought for on the basis of, well, if we want health care, we need gay marriage. If we want, property rights, whatever, we need gay marriage. It was a way of sort of letting the state absolve itself of its responsibility for something as basic as healthcare. And I think the problem is that having, quote unquote, won gay marriage, we've now decided that, yes, that's the way to go. That the state does not need to take care, the state bears no responsibility. It's up to us through our relationships to ensure that our partners have health care. So let's get married, let's keep instituting that particular system. So there's those sort of ideological issues as well around gay marriage. I also think the problem is that things like trans youth homelessness and so on are now being absorbed by corporations. I mean, it's become it's become it's almost a fashion statement now, right? With Cyndi Lauper, I think it's Cyndi Lauper, who has a homeless, youth shelter, I think, apparently. So all these celebrities are jumping on the bandwagon, and some of them may be doing good work, or I don't know, but these have become celebrity causes now, which means that, again, there are the usual problems around a lot of money. There's also the question of money, right? There's a lot of money being poured into very specific issues, and the problem will be who's looking after, who's keeping an eye on where that money actually goes. So we see in the center on Halstead, for instance, the money is going to the organization, but the way the money is distributed, it comes with a great deal of humiliation and a great deal of racism and a complete lack of care and actual desire to actually work with communities within their neighborhoods. I think we really have to consider how drastically the LGBTQ community has shifted in its politics to become so callous and uncaring towards so many. And it's not just in terms of LGBTQ youth and homelessness, which is sort of the fashionable topic that everyone wants to talk about now. It has been going on since at least the mid-90s, a little before that, where the LGBTQ community shifted from becoming a community that, for instance, marched with Haitians who were being forcibly quarantined in horrible camps because they were seen as the carriers of HIV. Right? And the queer community then marched in protest along with Haitians and demanded universal health care. And a lot of people have trouble even remembering this. But today we've come to a situation where the queer community or the gay community decided that the only way to get health care was to advocate for marriage. So I think there's been a huge, profound shift in the gay community at large, where it went from being a community that actually cared about more than just itself, and from becoming a community that cared about only the interests of a wealthy few, like Edith Windsor, right, who was actually a multimillionaire. They kept that fact hidden. But gay marriage is not something that's a universal solution for a vast majority of queer people who suffer from poverty, who suffer from stigma, who suffer from all kinds of issues, including homelessness. But I think corporate sponsorship is I would say that actually that corporate sponsorship is more of a symptom than a major cause.
Yeah, I don't actually know who Edith Windsor is.
Oh, okay, sure. So Edith Windsor is the plaintiff in the big marriage case that was decided in 2013. And it's the one that essentially paved the way for gay marriage becoming legal in all states. And I think she's now probably in her 70s, but she became the lead plaintiff because her partner died. Both of them were fairly well off. Her partner died, and she was faced with, I forget the number, about $365,000 or so, with a significant amount of money to pay in taxes, because she hadn't been married to her partner. And what she wanted was what married people have, which is when your spouse dies, it's called the death tax, basically. So, but essentially, Edith Windsor is worth about $10 million. Most married people are not going to be facing taxes of that sort. So so that's the big problem with the gay marriage fight, is that it sort of pretended that marriage would benefit people. Everyone talked about, oh, well, if I can get gay married, my spouse won't have to pay these marriage death taxes. But actually, those taxes only go to people who earn a certain percentage of income. So it's only the wealthy who would have to pay those taxes. And actually, taxes are what pay for our schools and our roads. So taxes are a good thing to pay. So it's another long, complicated story about how gay marriage has become staged as this thing which will give benefits to everyone, when in fact it actually only benefits very few, and also forces people now to get married if they want health care. So for instance, in Massachusetts, Illinois, and other places now, you can no longer remain on your partner. If you're in a civil union or a domestic partnership, they force you to get married if you want to remain on your partner's health care. So we've gone from, that's a state where people could choose to be in different kinds of relationships, to a place where we're told that you have to marry or die. I've heard good things about the LGBTQ Senior Center, but this is the center on Halstead, so I want to wait for about a year or so to really do a longitudinal study in terms of who really benefits. I've heard good things about it. I've heard some LGBTQ elders talk about how happy they are to be, and this is so important for them, right? Because it's important for them to spend. A lot of them don't have a lot of money, and they're often very isolated. So it's really important for them to be in an environment where the nurse aides aren't going to treat them with contempt just because they're LGBTQ, for instance, or because they're trans. I mean, those things are really important, especially when you're older, you're poor, and you're often isolated. And I've heard good things from people who've received that kind of housing. What I would like to see, so first, it is a center on Halstead. I've also heard about the services that they used to provide elderly people when they had some sort of scant resources, things like free lunches and so on. I've heard from people who've experienced them that they were not great, that they received terrible food, for instance, etc. So I don't trust the center on Halstead is the blunt way to put it. But also I think we need to wait a couple of years to see how it plays out in the long term. But I think more importantly, I think my concern with something like having an exclusive, elderly housing resource like what places are providing now is that we shouldn't just stop there. What we really need to do is to ensure that we start changing the environment in all nursing facilities, for instance, and in all senior centers. So this is always my concern. When we say things like, oh, let's have an LGBTQ high school, or let's have an LGBTQ senior resource, senior center, my concern is we stop thinking about the larger ways in which we have to change society. So what I would like to see is if Central and Halstead or Howard run all these places, and they haven't done this for decades, right? What I want to see is them working with the city to bring about changes everywhere. That's the work that they have not done, because they want to accrue that power to themselves. So I don't think it's so much about just corporate sponsorship. I think it's about the larger LGBTQ community, frankly, just not giving a damn. So I think, in that way, I think corporate sponsorship becomes the easy way as well for us looking on. Why is it a problem? So the first thing I want to say is that, especially in the matter of LGBTQ healthcare, right? Corporate sponsorship is relatively new. In many arenas of LGBTQ healthcare, corporate sponsorship is very new. I don't think we want to be nostalgic for a time when, for instance, we had no healthcare that was tended to by any companies at all, right? So if you think about the 1970s, 80s, and even part of the 90s, where we were desperately starving for healthcare, I don't think we necessarily want to return to that time. But corporate sponsorship of many aspects of LGBTQ life has been predominant since around the mid-90s. And it does give us access to resources that we never had before, like, for instance, pharmaceuticals. But it has also meant that the driving force behind in terms of what the LGBTQ or queer community needs has more to do with profits than it has to do with what the most marginal among us might require. So for instance, LGBTQ people who are not upper middle class or wealthy, trans youth, youth in general, right, people with HIV/AIDS are still not getting the resources they need because corporate sponsorship has meant that the profit motive has become predominant rather than thinking about what does the entire community need and require. And Howard Brown is a really good example of why, for instance, we do need corporate investment of sorts, right, in terms of, for instance, pharmaceuticals, in terms of access to health resources, especially in terms of grants, in terms of having a conduit to perhaps the federal government, and so on. So those things are necessary, but the hindrance has come in the ways in which, especially the Center on Halstead, has come down on the most marginal communities that it claims to serve, but actually oppresses. So the best example, so what corporate sponsorship, speaking in a very broad way, what corporate sponsorship simply means is that its vested interest, its larger money interest, is the interest of the wealthier gays that are being enabled. So with both Howard Brown and Central and Halstead, both of those organizations are very key to providing resources that are absolutely essential: healthcare, right? Social services, aid for the LGBTQ elderly, which is a fast-growing population. The problem is those organizations are mostly supported by not just corporate sponsors, but also by LGBTQ people, gay white men and women in particular, who happen to be tied to a much wealthier strata of class, right? And for that reason, they're concentrated, as you know, they're both located on the north side. So those resources are really only meant now to go to people on the north side, somewhat wealthier people, which means that people who are LGBTQ identified on the south and west sides have to trek a very long way just to get the most basic resources. That's one problem. Because corporate sponsorship has meant that the resources are only focused towards those who can advocate for them, and that's wealthier gay people, right? So that's one problem, is where they're located and how others have to move towards the north side, or rather have to travel to the north side to get those resources. The second, and even bigger and really perhaps much worse problem, is that that means that there's a great deal of racism towards those populations of people who come to the north side. There's racism not just in terms of what they encounter on the north side. As you know, almost every year for the last 10 odd years or 10, 15 years, almost every single summer there's a blow up in terms of neighbors, mostly white, wealthier neighbors off Central and Halstead, Howard Brown, complaining about all these black and brown people coming into the north side, right? So there's that. But it's not just the neighbors, it's also the institutions. Andersonville now is also now a kind of new boys' town. So it's interesting because they have these rules about not having a lot of big box names like Target and so on, but at the same time there are also a lot of franchises, so the neighborhoods all look the same. If you walk around Andersonville, it looks a lot like Lakeview because you have the same sort of retail retail stores. They just happen to be made to look quote unquote funky and homegrown. So I think in that sense, yes, and it's corporate sponsorship that's also paying for things like the repaving, right? The sort of redoing of the neighborhood. Those are the people. Chase, for instance, if you go to Uptown or if you go to parts of Lakeview, Chase has its signs everywhere. It sponsors parks, for instance. There's a small park in Uptown that was sponsored by Chase. So it does change the look of the neighborhood. But again, I think, it's a symptom rather than a cause. I think the issue is more about people deciding to have, on the one hand, so in Andersonville, for instance, they want the look of a cute, homely, kind of Swedish neighborhood feel, but they don't support local businesses. So a lot of local businesses in both in Boys Town and in Andersonville / Uptown now are being pushed out. So yes, so that does change. It changes the ways in which people relate to their neighborhood. It changes what kinds of commodities you can buy. It changes the price of things. Consider, for instance, what's going on in Hyde Park with Whole Foods becoming a major grocery store where we don't have anything affordable nearby, really, right? It is changing, and I think it's also it's working to push people out of the neighborhood. It's also disastrous because I lived in Andersonville, I lived in Uptown, I should say. It was gobbled up by Andersonville. I lived in Uptown from about 97 to about 2014, so I lived there for a really long time. And a lot of those businesses that come in don't actually last because there isn't actually an economic base in Chicago. All these places want to become the next Lincoln Square. They want to become the next expensive, ritzy neighborhood. But you can't really sustain that. And we saw that in 2008 with the collapse. So in Uptown where I live, there was this gigantic condominium complex that just lay, sort of undone, unfinished for years. I think it was only up to about 2013 or so that it finally got finished. And most of those units are still unoccupied. And that's the case even here. You have a lot of these expensive new condo rental units which are unoccupied because that money isn't sustainable. The way capitalism works doesn't make that kind of economy sustainable. So that's more sort of an effect of the idea that corporate culture is what we want in order to be seen as successful. That's the problem with the gay community. So this is what you see in Pride. The idea is that, well, if we don't have, now that we have corporate sponsors, we are a success, which is a crazy way to think about how to celebrate what Pride is, right? So it's not a complicated way of saying, well, what is actually queer history? Where does queer history begin, right? It began and it didn't really begin in Stonewall, but where does queer resistance begin, or where did it begin? It did not begin with corporate sponsors rushing in to reaffirm your identity. So that's why I keep saying that corporate sponsorship is sort of a reality, but is also a symptom of a much bigger problem, which is the way the gay community does not see itself as affirmed. The mainstream gay community does not see itself as actually affirmed until it receives all manner of recognition and affiliation with the corporate world. And a larger reason for that is also because so many LGBTQ people are now more and more out and open in gigantic corporations. So some of the most powerful gay people are also parts of corporations themselves, right? So there are sort of complicated histories. With institutions like Central and Halstead, the problem has been that, yes, they have bought into the idea that the only thing that matters is a certain relatively tiny section of the gay community. It is also that gay community that gives it and enables it and gives it access to the kinds of funds that you're likely to get from, say, the federal government. Now, that's going to get much worse when we have Hillary Clinton as president, because she is known to be someone who's very tied to large corporate interests. So I think that's going to get worse. I think the problem here is that either we have to do a number of things simultaneously. We have to start demanding change from a place like the Center on Halstead, which has had the same director almost, I think, from its moment of inception, for instance. So there has to be that fundamental shift. But we also have to start demanding that places like Center on Halstead become more accountable and more transparent to the people they claim to serve. Now, Howard Brown, I don't know if you know this, but I was the reporter who about 5 years ago actually worked on exposing the problems around Howard Brown. So it is now a very significantly different organization, much more transparent and so on. That's what needs to happen with a place like the Center on Halstead. It really does need to come much more from within communities, from the bottom up. But I think honestly people just feel safer signing some sort of change.org petition or praising Target for doing the quote-unquote right thing than to really have very difficult conversations among themselves. The Center on Halstead gets funding from the federal government and many other agencies, non-federal agencies as well, in order to supposedly provide services for the most marginal, like people of color, trans youth. It takes the money, and it gets millions of dollars. It takes the money, but treats those people as nothing but, they treat them really badly. I mean, so for instance, I think they still do this. We should check up on this, but even until a few years ago, they were shepherding young LGBTQ and trans youth through the back door. they were not allowing them to come in through the front door, claiming that this was for their own safety. But of course, as we all know, this has very long roots and a long history of racial discrimination. And the Center on Halsted is located in a very lovely old building, which also houses Whole Foods. Now, a lot of trans youth, LGBTQ youth, are also extremely poor, putting all their resources into just traveling up to the north side. Sometimes, yes, there were incidents where they were either shoplifting or they were accused of shoplifting. The Center on Halsted did not take what we in gender justice suggested was a restorative justice process, but instead simply set the police upon them. Right? So what this means is that, the kind of corporatization, the larger corporatization of the LGBTQ world has simply meant that the most marginal have to struggle to even gain the most basic of resources. And even when they have those resources that come to those organizations, because of all the attention given to the poorest among us, they're still treated like, well, they're just treated horribly. The other thing I would say, and I say this with caution and love and respect, is that there are a lot of people who, as they grow older, become more radical. A lot of them also become less radical. So the question has to become, I think I'm not the biggest supporter of Bernie Sanders or of Hillary Clinton. I'm on record for having said that, and I've written a lot.
I'm not a huge Bernie.
Right. But it's wonderful. But I also, I want to see where all this energy goes in terms of, fine, so now what? But also, how do we think about a radical politics of change outside of a one man, but also in terms of how we rethink the very structures that we've all been raised, especially in America, right? We've all been raised to think are the necessary structures. So around Occupy, which was before Bernie Sanders, right? So around the Occupy years, when it first started, that was around the 2008, as you know, the economic crisis, and I went to a lot of demonstrations and so on. And what I saw were a lot of signs of people that people had made saying, I lost my house, or I lost my job, et cetera, et cetera. And what I've seen in the United States in particular is that while there is a lot of anger about, quote unquote, the system, there isn't a lot of really deep analysis of, well, what is the system like? So for instance, why a lot of people were angry that they were no longer part of the housing economy, that they weren't no longer able to profit from that. They weren't able to get the housing loans they wanted. But there needs to be a much bigger interrogation in the United States of what does it mean that we actually think that being in debt for 40 years is a sign of success? That housing is not a universal right. In places like Germany, rentals are the norm, not home ownership. But in the United States, home ownership is still considered the only way to, the biggest proof of success is if you have a 50-year loan that you have to pay off, which is so ridiculous, right? So, and the same is true of things like education. It's not a question of, well, how can I, it really has to be about, and Sanders, to his credit, brought up this possibility of, well, why not just have free tuition for everyone? And that's the kind of radical rethinking, I think, that Americans aren't quite honed into yet. And I think we have a long way to go. So that's what I want to see. And I am curious to know, because I know and I'm not off that generation, but a lot of 60s radicals became just so embedded in the system. So I'm curious to know where all the energy will go. In terms of radical politics, radical queer politics, I am curious to know where we go next. And I'm actually going to be writing a little bit about that.